But he doesn't just give us words, he gives us thoughts and ideas and a lot of inspiration. Believe it or not, it's nearly impossible to count the number of federal laws. Most experts believe that Congress has passed between 200 and 600 laws in each of its 112 biennial terms. That would mean that there have been about 20,000 federal laws enacted since 1789. However, that count doesn't differentiate among the new laws, amendments to existing laws, and laws that repeal other laws. It also doesn't include case law or agency regulations with the force of law. In all of those hundreds of thousands of pages of laws and regulations, there is one single paragraph that means more to us than all the rest of the words combined. In Project 9, Persuade with Power, from the Competent Communication Manual, Lloyd Smith will show us that paragraph and explain why it is so important. Lloyd Smith and 45 most important words.
It's true, nobody can actually count the number of federal laws there are. In fact, in 1982, the U.S. Department of Justice decided to try to figure out how many federal crimes there were. After 2 years of work, they concluded it was impossible to know. There seemed to be between 3,000 and 7,000 federal offenses, but nobody has any idea for sure, not even the Department of Justice. Luckily for us, we have a founding document, the U.S. Constitution, which backstops all of the laws, and even more fortunately, by the way, I don't believe there are enough of those to go around, so if some of you could share, that would be a nice thing. Even more fortunately for us, though, we have a Bill of Rights in the U.S. Constitution that establishes our basic rights. What you have in front of you is the text of the First Amendment to that Constitution, the first element of the Bill of Rights. Those are the 45 words, the most important paragraph, I think, in all of the hundreds of thousands of pages of federal legislation there is. Let's take a look at this and see what it actually says and see if we can figure out why it is so important to us. Notice there that it's divided into 3 clauses. It says, and I gave mine away too, it says, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. I'm not going to spend very much time on that one because it seems so self-evident to us, doesn't it? I mean, after all, we are sitting in the basement of a church called the First United Methodist Church. But within 10 miles of this spot, there are probably at least 2 or 3 or 4 dozen. I have no idea how many churches there are in Wenatchee, but it's many, 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 of all different denominations. And that doesn't strike any of us as strange at all. But there are many other countries on earth where it would be very strange. In fact, it would be illegal. It could get you in jail to have the wrong religion. Those countries range from theocratic dictatorships like Iran, but also to countries like Great Britain, where there is an established church. There's a single official Christian church, which is the state religion of Great Britain. It's called the Anglican Church. In this country, we call it the Episcopal Church. It even gets tax money because it's the established church. And the Queen is called the Defender of the Faith because she's the head of the church. Let's look at the 3rd clause of this. Congress shall make no law abridging the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. There again, we don't even think about that. I mean, it's second nature to us to complain about the government, to have street demonstrations if we feel like it. People in this country even call reporters to tell them they're going to have a street demonstration to protest the government. It's quite legal for us to tell our representatives what we think and ask them to change things. There are numerous other countries on earth where that isn't the case at all. For example, in Myanmar, the former country of Burma, it's illegal to criticize the government. There are thousands of people in prison in Burma because they have had the nerve to do that. Some of them talking to their friends who turned out to be secret police informers. To us, that seems so bizarre that we can't even imagine not complaining about the government. What would talk radio do to give it a real world face? Let's focus on the middle one of these. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. That's actually the key element of the First Amendment, and it's the one that everything else depends on. Also, by the very nature of our group, it's the one that we focus on most of all. After all, we are speaking. Think about that for a second. Freedom of speech. Now, that's widely misunderstood. If you've ever been around a teenager, you've been around somebody who misunderstands it. It doesn't mean that anybody can say anything he or she feels like, although that's really pretty close. The courts, as you know, probably, if you think back to your high school days, the interpretation of what the Constitution means and whether or not all the laws fit under it relies on the court system and eventually on the Supreme Court. Over the years, the Supreme Court has evolved in its thinking, and they have come to the conclusion that freedom of speech means we have the right to think what we want and to express our thoughts in about any way we see fit, as long as our thoughts don't also become actions that endanger public safety or encourage people to commit crimes. The classic example of that is the notion of standing up in a theater and yelling fire. You can't do that because it would endanger public safety. Now, what that means in the real world is that I can call up a radio talk show and explain that I think Obama is the new Hitler and he's plotting to stay in office after his term of office is over, and he's the worst thing that's ever happened to America, and nothing much will happen. But if I also say that we should get in our car with our guns and go to Washington, D.C. and hunt him down, that's a no-no, because it, first of all, violates federal law, but it endangers public safety as well. In other words, we are free to say and do anything we want, and I mean do as well, because the court has analyzed freedom of speech to include actions. That's why, for example, if you chose to burn that flag, most of us wouldn't like it much, but it's not illegal. It's protected thought. If you think about it for a moment, burning an American flag is most certainly an expression of a political theory. It's one that nobody much likes, but nonetheless, it's still a political theory. The same is true for artworks and whatnot that have political themes. Now, the other side of the coin is, though, we are responsible for not endangering public safety, and really, we shouldn't be idiots when we talk either, although people listen to talk radio.
Yeah, right.
The other end of that, freedom of the press. That's widely misunderstood too. I know people who have written letters to the editor that were not published, and they've complained that their freedom of the press was violated. Freedom of the press doesn't belong to us. It belongs to the people who own the press. In other words, if you're a publisher, you have the right to publish nearly anything. There again, the courts have ruled that what that means is that you can publish anything that does not endanger public safety or does not encourage people to commit crimes. Where that was adjudicated was the Pentagon Papers. Those of you old enough to remember that back in the 70s may recall that a guy named Daniel Ellsberg stole the whole bunch, like hundreds of thousands of pages of documents of a secret history of how the U.S. got involved in the Vietnam War. And then he gave them to two newspapers that started to print them. The federal government argued that they should not be allowed to print them, and the Supreme Court ruled that prior restraint, meaning you couldn't stop something being printed in advance, was illegal. That both of those rights, freedom of speech and the freedom of press, are so unusual around the world. In Turkey right now, there are more than 2,000 journalists in prison because they criticize the government. There are numerous places where a lot worse has happened to people who have printed or said things that were opposed to their governments. We have a very unusual system in this country, but that First Amendment is the key to everything else. Now, in order to protect it, though, we need to do something else. We have a personal example here in this club. There are probably not two people in this room more unlike one another in political viewpoint than Jack Bevere and me. I've heard numerous of Jack's speeches about political topics and economic theory, and I think he is basically a loon. However, and this is critically important, if I want my freedom of speech, if I want my right to say what I believe, I have to make sure Jack has his right too. The reason is, if it were possible to shut Jack up, what would stop anybody from shutting me in? And I mean that. We all have to ensure everybody has the rights that we want, or there's no way for us to have them. That's why that one paragraph, those 45 words, are the most important things written in all of the hundreds of thousands of words of federal law there are.